50 years ago is one of the most contentious arguments to grip our country. In living rooms and coffee shops alike, everyone had an opinion about the adoption of the flag. Well, joining us now to take us back to that time and the decisions that led to its creation, in Antigonish, Nova Scotia via Skype, John Blackwell, historian and director of the Research Grants Office at St. Francis Xavier University, and in our nation's capital, Margaret Bedeau-Lawrence, a former Canadian Foreign Service officer. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pia.
Thank you, Pia.
You both have personal, familial stories to the flag, and I want to just start with that. So, John, let's start with you. What's your connection to the Canadian flag?
Well, my father-in-law, George Stanley, who was an historian and Dean of Arts at the Royal Military College in Kingston, came up with the conceptual design for the flag.
Okay. That's a pretty good heritage to have. You're pretty proud of that?
Yes, indeed.
And Margaret, it was your grandfather who actually got involved in the long path towards the flag to 1965. How was he involved?
Well, my grandfather, Alan Bedeau, was a heraldry expert and artist who had been quite involved in wanting to create designs for a new Canadian flag. As early as 1955, he had approached then Prime Minister Louis Saint-Laurent. Subsequently, he approached Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. But it was only when Prime Minister Lester Pearson in the early 1960s really became committed to a new flag that he finally was able to see some of his designs come to fruition. And it was my grandfather who, in fact, produced the design of what became known as the Pearson pennant.
And in your grandfather's thinking, I mean, why did he feel that Canada needed a new flag prior to '64 when Pearson comes in and campaigns on this promise?
It had a lot to do with the maturing of Canada as a country. He had served very proudly under the Red Ensign. He had served in World War I. He had served in World War II, as had my father. But there was, I think, a sense that Canada was maturing as a country and that it was time to grow up and have its own iconic emblem.
Okay, so we get to '64, John, and Pearson is campaigning, and he promises, here's my election promise, I'll get your own flag, Canadians, if I'm elected. Was that a popular idea back then?
Well, it was an idea that Lester Pearson was very committed to. He must have been quite nervous when he actually got elected because he had a minority government. And the issue was approached very quietly in the beginning. It was done with close associates, and then it became a public debate in the House of Commons, and it became evident very quickly. In March of 1964, Mr. Pearson and his right-hand person, John Matheson, who was the MP for Leeds, where Brockville, Ontario is located, took the Pearson pennant to the national meeting of the Royal Canadian Legion, and he was, of course, a veteran himself, decorated veteran, and he was booed mercilessly by 2,000 delegates at that convention. So he stood up very courageously to them, but it was clear from that point on that the flag, the search for a Canadian flag was not going to be easy.
And to that point, let me just bring out some facts here of what the long road to the flag was. So a 15-member all-party parliamentary committee reviews the suggestions and made a final recommendation. 5,900 designs are sent to Ottawa. There were 308 speeches in Parliament. And then, middle of the morning, at 2:15 on December 15th, 1964, the House voted 163 to 78 in favor of the maple leaf. That's how this all came to be. But I want to deconstruct this a bit. 308 speeches were made. John, most of them were against it. What were the objections?
Well, as Margaret said, many Canadians at that point were of British extraction, first of all. They were English, they were Scottish, they were Irish, they were Welsh. And many of them had fought under the Red Ensign, which featured the British Union Jack. And so some of them had been injured, some of them had died, some of them had come back. Many of them had come back, of course. But they had fought under this noble, ancient flag, and they felt that it was an act of treachery to abandon it.
Okay, and then ordinary Canadians make suggestions as well. They make submissions. Margaret, can you tell us about a few of those candidates?
Well, there were a number of different designs, everything from young school children sending in their suggestions to A.Y. Jackson submitted a design proposal. Many of those proposals featured maple leaves. This had been an emblem that had been associated with Canada for decades. And it had been worn by Olympic athletes. It had been worn, of course, by members of our military. The maple leaf figured very prominently in many, many of these designs. And I think it was quite early on that those that were really inside the process of creating a new flag narrowed their view to having something that involved a maple leaf, either one maple leaf or three maple leaves.
Okay. We're going to bring that photo back up that we're showing. John, I'm going to get you to comment on this. I don't know if you could see it, but this is a navy maple leaf with 10 red stars in the middle. What do you think about that? Yeah.
Well, this was the contributor of this flag proposal called it the Maple Spangled Banner, and of course it's a Canadian take on the Star Spangled Banner, and it has 10 stars representing the Canadian provinces. It's an interesting proposal because it sort of reflects the continentalism of the time and the incredible American influence on Canada during the 1960s and the 1950s. So one historian has written that Canada went from colony to nation to colony because we sort of went from British influence to American influence, and it's an interesting reflection of that.
All right, let's bring up flag number 2, as we're calling it. Let's bring up this one. So this one has, there we go, another maple leaf in the middle. Wow, that's crazy, this flag. Crazy looking, I shouldn't say that. And then up there we have the British flag. What do you think of, what's the story behind this one, John?
Well, the creator of this one called it the flag maker's dream. I agree with you, Pia. I would call it a flag maker's nightmare. What this person has tried to do is to please everybody. And it's a classic example of what not to do when you're designing a flag. I mean, it has the Union Jack, it has fleur-de-lis that look like exclamation marks, it has the national motto from sea to sea in Latin. They've thrown everything into the pot. And if you were to actually fly this, it would just be a blur of unrecognizable images.
It would also be hard as a child to draw that flag. Okay, let's bring up the last one and get you to comment on this one as well, John. Here we go.
This is one of my favorites. This is, of course, Mike, the four Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And this was an anonymous contribution, obviously a young person who was a big fan of the Beatles. So again, it reflects this amazing culture of rebellion in the 1960s.
That would have been great if we got that flag, wouldn't it? It'd be funny. Okay, Margaret, so your grandfather creates the Pearson pennant. So why did he think that should be the flag of choice?
Well, I think he, like many other people, thought the maple leaf should be the symbol. The three maple leaves conjoined on a single stem had frequently been used as a Canadian symbol throughout the 19th century and early 20th century. The blue bars on the Pearson pennant were to reflect the Canadian motto, from sea to sea. And when he presented this to Prime Minister Pearson in early May of 1964, Pearson was immediately enthralled with it and chose that as his preferred option in terms of a new flag. And of course, that was the option that was then subsequently presented, as John mentioned, to the, or announced at least, at the Royal Canadian Legion meeting in Winnipeg that year.
And then the parliamentary committee ultimately turns it down, says it's a no-go. Why did it do that? Prime Minister liked it.
Well, I think, the Prime Minister liked it, and because the Prime Minister liked it, the Liberal members of the committee were, of course, behind it and were soldiering on. But I think very early in the committee's proceedings, and remember, the committee only met for about 6 weeks, from early September to mid-October of 1964, it became very clear early on that the Conservative members of the committee, reflecting the view of their leader, John Diefenbaker, were not going to support that flag, and that the Liberals then on the committee needed to find an alternative, which they clearly did.
And they did. John, how did your father-in-law come up with the final design?
Well, when John Matheson, who was Pearson's point person in this whole project, started canvassing his friends, in March of 1964, he went to lunch with George Stanley at the Royal Military College in Kingston. And after they'd come out talking about heraldry and the flag and the challenge ahead of the government, George looked up at the flag flying atop the Mackenzie building, which is the main historic building at the Royal Military College. And he said, "There, John, is your flag." And I characterize this as the eureka moment when the idea for the flag was born. And John Matheson said, "Oh, you can't possibly use the RMC flag for Canada. What do you mean, George?" And he said, "Oh, no, John, just leave the red bars at each side, leave the white field in the middle, take off the college crest, and put on one single stylized maple leaf to represent the unity of Canada."
And there it is. Okay, Margaret, what did your grandfather think of this design?
Well, I don't think he was particularly enamored to begin with. But he was again, he was also a dutiful soldier, like many of the others. He had spent many long hours rendering the artistic paintings of flag designs. The flag committee was bringing him many of the designs that they wanted to consider, and of course, famously, the flag committee's wall in their committee room was plastered with all sorts of designs, most of which were actually done by my grandfather, and they would have done in proper heraldic terms. And so when in October 1964, John Matheson brought George Stanley's design to my grandfather, I think at that point my grandfather he was being asked to make so many designs and so many design changes, and 2 or 3 a day. And I think at that point it was just one more design that he had to do. And I think he was getting quite fed up with the whole process at that point. But he rendered it as John Matheson had requested it. And that was tacked up on the wall with the other designs, and subsequently, of course, went into the voting process for the committee on October 22nd.
And here we are, 50 years later, 2015, the city of Brockville wants to be recognized as the birthplace of the Canadian flag. The two of you have been writing op-eds, and Margaret, you've given a deputation arguing that this shouldn't be. Why not?
Because it's not true. Quite simply, John Matheson was the member of Parliament representing the riding that included Brockville, but that does not make Brockville the birthplace of the flag. John Matheson played an absolutely key, pivotal role in the whole process, but that does not make Brockville the birthplace of the flag. And to claim that is quite simply ridiculous.
All right, come Sunday, come the 50th anniversary, there is going to be a ceremony to mark the 50th anniversary of our flag. You going to be there, Margaret?
I will. In fact, I will be at the ceremony here in Ottawa. There will be a ceremony at 10:30 a.m. at Confederation Park, which I plan to attend. And I am also going to attend the Flag Fest in Brockville, which will be taking place later in the afternoon. Because I believe strongly in celebrating the flag. This is a big anniversary of the flag. It's an iconic national symbol, and it's something that we should and can all be proud of. And we need to, I think we need to wave the flag a little bit more than we tend to do as Canadians.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.